coloured communities say they feel marginalised by government. They shut down Johannesburg's Westbury, Ennerdale and Eldorado Park this week after the death of a mother in a shooting allegedly related to gangs. Besides protesting against crime, these predominantly coloured suburbs say they aren't being afforded equal black economic empowerment opportunities. We discussed what's going on with Research Director at Auwal Socio-Economic Research Institute, Angelo Fick.
So what I think we must recognise, and this is where people like Elaine Sallow, who used to do research on places like Johannnesburg, and there are people who are doing research on places like Westbury and Eldorado Park, will point to is the role that during apartheid, the encouraging of gang formation by the apartheid state is partly responsible for the way in which communities currently configure themselves around criminality inside communities. But that goes back to the point of unfinished business. It is the responsibility of this society to undo the effects of apartheid and colonialism. We have had 25 years of trying to undo this. This is a failure not just of government, it is a failure of the state altogether, of the society more generally, because partly we need to unmake those consequences, but we also need to reconfigure the ways in which people are allowed to think about themselves. Just because people think of themselves as fantastic tap dancers does not mean that they necessarily are fantastic tap dancers. And so increasingly we need to give younger people and all South Africans, all 58 million of us, the tools to understand ourselves differently from the terms that we were defined by in apartheid or in colonial South Africa, because that was the point of the post-apartheid project, not just to forget that the past existed, but to unmake it and to reimagine the future differently. We are now in the future of that past. And I think it is important for us to think of those communities as being affected by questions of poverty, questions of service delivery lack, questions of poor policing, and questions of a lack of cohesion and integration into an understanding of what the post-apartheid South Africa could be and should be for them. And there are definitely failures of government that need to be accounted for, but there are also failures of imagination that we need to take on board as a society and teach people in our communities to think of themselves differently, to think of themselves as what they have in common with other people, not just those old differences of the Population Registration Act.
And perhaps in terms of giving people new options in terms of responding to situations. Just looking at those visuals there, a lot of the response to the total shutdown protests and the situation in Westbury on social media have been, once again, finger-pointing. Why do communities resort to destruction of property? Why burning tyres? Why violence? Why do the police resort to using rubber bullets and firing on what would otherwise be classified as a peaceful protest? Not to get into those details too much, but I want to talk about the responses across the board to each other, to situations. How can we better respond? So
those are old habits that die very hard. Those are old habits that we've learnt over generations in South Africa that we haven't been given the tools to learn new habits for. The old habits of an uncaring government official that's not a new habit. That is the habit of apartheid and colonial South Africa towards entire groups of people. The habit of taking a social protest in apartheid South Africa and mimicking it in post-apartheid South Africa. The frustration that community members feel towards absent officials. All of this, of course, is not just related to the past, but it's engendered and made in the present of actual existing relations between government officials at all three tiers of government and individual communities. If members of parliament, if members of legislatures at provincial and municipal level actually lived in communities that are affected by this, we might see a very different kind of South Africa. So a new imagination must be engendered. People should start demanding that members of parliament live inside the communities, inside of townships, that their children should go to local government schools, that they should use the local clinic. And we might see a very different shift in the ways in which those communities work. Because if I have power in parliament or in a municipal legislature to change things, my parents, my daughters, my sons having to live in those communities with me would shift those communities. And that idea of the spatial rearrangement of South Africa, which was supposed to come with post-apartheid South Africa, which hasn't been realized. It's what Terry Bell and Dumiza Nzibeza, among other things, call the unfinished business of post-apartheid South Africa. Things from the past we haven't changed. If we change the layout of those communities by putting people with power inside those communities and holding them accountable, that's an act of imagination that we can then start using to say, this is how communities can be shifted. Because this idea that these people are represented by people in parliament who do not live with them, who do not face their everyday realities, who do not have to imagine how to get from work 35 kilometers back home when the infrastructure of a transport system isn't working because Metro Rail has been allowed to fail spectacularly, when transport planning is done for people with cars, not necessarily for public transportation. This integrated vision of a changed South Africa is one that I think should be inclusive. And that means listening to communities in ways that are far more productive, because often these communities get to the point where they feel, as members of the community, they have to burn the stuff around because no one has listened to them. It's an old habit that has died hard, but it's also an old habit born of frustration. And it is when people say they've been ignored or they've not been included, it's often also because they haven't been signaled or they haven't been taught to see how they've been included and how they can use those tiny levers of inclusion to include themselves more. And so there is failure on all sides here. This is not for me a game where we can simply point to this official failed. I think we all need to take collective responsibility and ask ourselves, what have we done, we who do not live in those communities, we who've moved out of those communities, to think of making an integrated society? This is the most unequal society on earth. And we have just had the crime statistics released to us, and several observers, people who study crimes, sociologists, criminologists have pointed out, you will not have a crime-free South Africa until you have a more equal South Africa. And this inequality is not just one of material wealth or opportunity, it is also of the distances we have to travel to get to those opportunities and what services we are granted in our communities and which are not. And that old logic of the haves and the have-nots is partly underpinning this kind of frustration that builds up into these violent and often really violating explanations that people have. So they say, we are not getting anything because we look a certain way and have a certain kind of skin tone. Those people are getting things because they have a certain kind of skin tone, which ignores what we may have in common, which is actually all of us may be disadvantaged in particular ways. How do we work together to make sure that the disadvantage disappears and that the state responds actively and timeously to the needs of our community? Because I think this idea of division is not particularly helpful, and we need to start educating people and ourselves to start thinking inclusively and together, because again in South Africa it is all of us together or none of us at all. This idea that you can build walls, that you can put people far away, we tried that experiment twice before, colonialism and apartheid, it did not work. This continued insistence that you can have this lovely society of deep divisions of class and access to resources that are now based not on colour so much, but much more on, shall we say, class position. That, I think, is not sustainable. We've tried it before, it doesn't work. We need to have reimagined politics and a politics of commonality rather than just these politics of divisions and dehumanization.
Do you think reimagined politics would be enough of a catalyst to spark that inclusionary thought in ordinary South Africans?
That also would have to be backed up by material changes. So this is also the role and the function of government, because part of local government's function was to undo the spatial logics of apartheid. We've had 15 years of that. That hasn't happened sufficiently. Part of that is changing the transport networks, changing where we have economic opportunities, and some local government initiatives have attempted to do this, but it's also that integration between local, provincial and national government that has to work more, efficiently. And communities have to be empowered, and part of this is education. We have an education system that has failed actively to create citizenship around new notions of commonality. We continue to refer to people, even when we tell stories about them, by Population Registration Act categories, even though there may be very other complex, more interesting dynamics in those communities that explain these phenomena, which is not to discount race, which is not to say that race has not had real effects, but it is to think more creatively and actually to pay closer attention to what's actually happening on the ground. And that is partly thinking with communities through their problems, rather than coming in and saying, you people are all wrong, this is not how it works, to say, this is what you say is going on. Let's think creatively about what else we could see that is going on here. Instead of just saying this is what this community has as different from that community, what is it that these two communities have in common that they could work together on? And that's, I think, empowering people more, because in the end, there are so many things that draw South Africans together, that profess in the majority a commitment to faith, They profess in the majority a commitment to the future of their children. They profess in the majority a commitment to peace and to living with one another in a certain kind of peaceful society. Well, those are common goals. Let us use those to work together instead of harping on old divisions that were given to us, that had real consequences for us, that we can in our lifetimes unmake and undo with the help and agitation of government officials who are elected to do precisely this. And it is that working together that I think should be something that we embrace, and that we can see various communities embracing, whether it is farming communities, reimagining what a farm is. It's not just the white farmers, it's the people who live in those spaces. And so similarly, in these spaces that used to be defined by legislation as coloured areas, it might be useful for communities and community leaders and ordinary people to start thinking beyond those definitions to what they have in common with the millions of other South Africans who are suffering similar fates, and then work with those South Africans to get access to resources from the governments that they elect in our totals of, 58 million people, for all of us. Because in this country, it's all of us together or none of us at all.